Oh yeah, another set of powers that I would like to have, at least like that I mentioned in one of my previous random things I like to talk about videos, are I think flying and teleportation. As well, for teleportation, it'd be very convenient as I could literally go anywhere I want just by either thinking or even entering portals. Kind of like how the game like Portal would allow you to be teleported anywhere, though you need a portal gun for that. Though in my case, I would like to say think up portals of my own while also being able to manipulate space in order to get where I want. Though I guess like it would be easy to abuse, so I would have to be careful on how I would use such a power, as it could literally be held in the wrong hands if anyone else had a similar power. And for flying, I'd like to explore the skies, or at least like explore other places through flight without having to get stuck in traffic jams or anything. Though I had to be careful with other flying creatures or objects like birds or planes or even like parachutes and or even bugs, especially given how it's easy to kind of like get attacked by them, at least depending on what species they are. But nonetheless, you have to be very careful with how you use these powers. But it would be neat to have a power like that, especially since the majority of superheroes especially have flying or I guess air-based abilities, especially if it's also psychic, kind of like telekinesis or levitation of some kind. But overall, it'll be very interesting to see how that work in real life. Another unique thing about me that you probably don't know. Then again, I'm still just like a YouTuber, like or at least a beginner YouTuber, I guess. Where it's that one thing I like to do is listen to music anytime I can. Where sometimes I like to listen to music when I'm say reading, writing, or doing homework, studying, and I especially like to listen to it during like my exercise sessions as it helps I guess stimulate my brain when it comes to stuff like that. And I even like to listen to music in the shower as I like to sing in the shower at times, but that's like only I guess rarely, though I only did it recently, as before I just like to ramble or talk to myself while I was showering, or even hum or sing at times. But enough about that. Also, another thing I learned about music is that it's actually very well, you know how I mentioned it was stimulating, where I actually heard this one story from an old pastor of mine at this church I used to go to, where he told me that he met this other pastor that did a sort of say a social experiment regarding music and how it can like subconsciously stimulate people into well not exactly dancing but moving to the rhythm or the beat as he with the permission of the manager at this restaurant the pastor ended up like playing certain genres of music to see how the customers would react as the customers they were to get up and get their food from the counter where the food was being placed and bring it back to their tables and as a result they they were discovered to have been I guess like sort of dancing or swaying to the music because it was you could say that much of an earworm to them but also it showed how music is practically essential in life for everyone and I thought it was a pretty interesting story to tell though I don't know what the pastor's name was or the pastor that did the experiment but I thought it was like interesting, especially since like we're so used to having music or even songs play in our lives that we don't seem that we tend to forget just how influential they are, at least when it comes to I guess a person's like mental or emotional state. Yeah, and even one person pointed out music practically fulfills the emotional aspect of the person, or you could say it fulfills the person's soul, and I guess their spirit in a way. So yeah, I thought it was interesting to talk about. I think my biggest dream when I was younger was to well, not exactly make an impact in the world, but rather I just wanted to use my creative skills for something that I could, I guess, like put into as a sort of a passion of mine, especially when it came to like stories where I recall that ever since I was young, I always liked reading and even drawing, but it was the stories that I was into. And I even liked to tell stories to people whenever I could, either made up or I could just repeat what other people said in order to make them laugh or at least catch their interest, like I'm kind of doing right now, but through videos and I guess pictures. However, in this case, like when I was younger, I really liked movies, like mostly animated movies, like the ones you'd see from Disney or DreamWorks. Though personally, I prefer 2D animation because, like, let's be honest, it's basically a lost art at this point, right? Where CG animation is a lot more noticeable. I mean, sure, it may seem better and I guess cheaper, but there's something about 2D animation that always intrigued me because they could, I guess, portray the facial features or the actions and body languages of certain characters. And it helps that a lot of characters are specifically designed to be appealing or relatable, if you know what I mean. But anyway, like as I mentioned earlier, I always liked animation because it seemed much easier to handle than live action. However, like, I thought, at least when I was younger, I thought animation was, you could say, my destiny or my dream job. But it wasn't until later did I realize that it was actually the story and the writing that I liked, especially since I could analyze certain plot points or learn about them, especially through TV tropes, as I happened to discover by completely by accident. And I guess that's what helped me look into the various cinematic or literary devices, along with the various tropes or cliches you could find in these kinds of scenarios. Yeah, and given how I liked reading books a lot, especially novels or even, and maybe sometimes comics or manga, you could say. But overall, I just felt that something had changed when it came to my personal interests in entertainment, and it wasn't animation, rather it was writing that I became more, I guess, attached to or gravitated to the point where I actually stopped drawing for a while and decided to focus more on writing. Like at first, like I wanted to write my own fanfic, you could say, as that was when I realized that I wanted to write stuff. And given that I'm actually currently working on a fanfic right now, which I'll talk about in another video, but in this case, like my earliest fanfic idea was like this boy who would travel to various other worlds as a sort of, like, not exactly a superhero, but he was supposed to help like people with their various kind of like problems and issues, and he would specifically focus on worlds from anime, manga, or even video games, right? But over time, I realized that like maybe it could work better as less of a crossover fanfic, but more of an original story. However, like I had to cut out the dimension hopping aspect, and but because my character was a bit of a, you could say, a Mary Sue, like though at that time I had no idea what Mary Sue was until later, so I kind of scrapped it. However, elements of it still exist within some of my story concepts I'm planning, which I also want to talk about in another video. But in this case, I want to talk about how exactly I started my interest in writing, where it came all the way from the idea of like fan fiction and crossovers, which is something that I've always been intrigued by when it comes to like stories, like either in movies, TV shows, comics, or even video games and various other forms of mediums when it comes to entertainment, especially if it's animation styled. So I thought it was interesting, like to see if I could do something like that myself. Though over time I wanted to focus less on making fanfic and more of like my original stories, hence why I started making story concepts and plot points I could utilize in the future, and hopefully I could officially publish it and maybe see it in like, say, bookstores or libraries one day, though that'll probably be years from now, so what can you do? Speaking of crossovers, the crossovers are one thing that always intrigued me and actually prompted my love for writing, or at least fanfics, like until I moved on to original stories, as I've always liked the idea of two completely different characters, especially if they're from different universes, like appearing to each other, right? Especially if they actually exist in the same universe but didn't meet each other until then, which I thought was pretty neat. And I actually want to do something like that in my stories, both fan made and original, though that'll be probably like years from now. And another, say, trope or cinematic device that I really like is world building, where I've always liked how various worlds, or like especially, or at least the fictional world in these stories, like they are elaborated or expanded more on through various other stories, such as prequels or spin-offs or even interquels, which I want to use, like especially for my original stories, as I have a certain pet project that I'm planning in the future, which will feature a lot of world building, because I think world building is one of the most important elements, as it focuses on the setting but at the same time elaborates more on the characters' histories, especially if they're connected to various other characters and how they live or where they live and what time periods it could be from, if it's, say, like a historical period one, but that's like another story for another time. But while I am open to many different, you could say, tropes or plot devices and want to experiment with them, especially when it comes to different genres, like there are some that I really don't like or find really annoying, but like to each their own, no judgment on whether you actually like them or not. Yeah, where one thing that I don't like is retcon, as or retroactive continuity, that's their technical term, where I don't like how retcons kind of undermine certain plot elements, like say a character had died but then suddenly they're revealed to have been alive again. I mean, if it was done properly without making it, as some people call, an ass pull, then maybe it would make sense, but most of the retcons that I see either kind of ruin the character development or undermine the story's theme or moral. Yeah, especially since my stories will always feature a certain moral or life lesson that could definitely be applied to people, especially since nowadays most stories tend to rely on fluff or needless filler or even anything that's too like sexually explicit, which yeah, definitely I want to avoid. And while I don't mind I don't mind like fan service, like the kind that focuses more on the lore or even other characters that people like. But I want to avoid the explicit fan service because I feel like people use the sex sells method way too much. But anyway, like back to what I was saying, another trope that I don't like is like plot holes. As plot holes, like retcons, they tend to sometimes undermine the story, or they raise a lot more questions than answer them, and they even tend to leave a lot of loose threads hanging, which sometimes leaves certain plot points unresolved, which always bugged me, because there's one thing that I definitely want to do is avoid leaving loose threads hanging in my story, as I want the answers to be questioned for my readers. I mean, that is if I gain any interest from readers, and I just want to at least make things conclusive in a decisive manner. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Well, and one last thing that I want to talk about is what TV shows call the aborted arc, where like retcons and plot holes, they tend to leave a lot of things unresolved or raise more questions, especially since like certain plot points, like a character having to like do something special, or they're holding a secret but it never gets told or unresolved, or I mean resolved. They tend to, I guess, leave people hanging, and aborted arcs, they need to, like, if they're going to write a story, they need to finish it first before they can do anything special, or at least they can focus on another plot, because if they don't, then what was the point of telling the story in the first place? Oh yeah, back to what I was saying regarding my dream of being a writer, where I want to, I guess, while I will start with writing books or stories, either online or even hardcover if possible, where one thing I want to do with my stories is eventually make a multimedia franchise of my own. Yeah, well, maybe not on the level of Disney or something, but maybe something kind of similar, though I'm not sure which, I guess, production company I would work with, or if I could do it independently, like a sort of indie genre, because I feel like indie genres are very, like, you could say, underrated. Yeah, like, maybe something like A24 or something like that, but who knows. Well, anyway, for my multimedia franchise, I'd like to have my stories be told through novels, like as regular novels, light novels, graphic novels, or even web novels. Yeah, well, not like the site, but maybe there. But overall, I'd like to do something that focuses more on my personal stories and how they could, well, either be intertwined with each other, like they take place in the same universe, like you could say the MCU, or they could be standalone stories. But overall, I want to at least focus on my stories being expanded through various different mediums of entertainment, yeah, especially if they're animated. Or I wouldn't mind if it was animated as, like, say, through a movie or even a TV show adaptation, or even, well, maybe not like a live action drama, but something like that. But overall, I want to at least create something that's noticeable, but at the same time spreads like good morals without making it look like complete like corporate sellout or whatever. But I guess like that depends on how you view certain things. But anyway, like overall, I feel like it's, well, it's not easy, but I feel like people have better chances of creating multimedia franchises. Speaking of independent animation or entertainment in general, I've always liked how independent entertainment companies or productions, like either through official, I guess, company buildings or even online, they have their own sense of flair that allows them to not only tell stories or entertain people, but they also like have much more creative freedom that's not so restricted by producers or executives constantly meddling or even ruining certain things. And I respect them for having the freedom to like make whatever they please, as long as it's, I guess, well, in their eyes appropriate, or if it fits within the narrative or the story that they're trying to tell, right? And I kind of want to do something like that in the future, like maybe like, well, not exactly create my own like company, but I want to at least be something like a, maybe a freelance story writer or author. I don't know. I don't want to just be like, I don't want to be constantly like constrained by rigid executives who won't allow creative freedom, and as I feel it undermines the plot or it tries to change too much into what they believe is best for the story and not me. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like, sometimes I wish that corporations or major, like, supposed film or book companies would at least allow their writers to have proper management, or at least have proper licenses when it comes to creating their own works. But I don't know, it seems like every year it gets more rigid or constrained, which I really want to avoid in the future. Speaking of Disney, I think the one thing I want to do is visit either Disneyland or Disney World, but only to see just how like interesting it actually is, as I've met some people who went there and really liked it, and I wanted to see if it actually lived up to the like hype that people would talk about regarding that. Though personally I've always liked Disney, but I just don't like the corporate aspect and how they're ironically undermining animation, despite the fact that the whole thing started with animation and or animated movies in the first place. So what can you do? Another thing I want to visit or at least experience is the Toronto International Film Festival, as I've heard a lot of things about it, and a lot of good movies are actually found there, at least before they're properly released in theaters. And I want to see like just how like artistic it is, especially if like Disneyland or Disney World, it lives up to the hype that people like say it does. You know, which I'm surprised it's still open despite like COVID kind of getting in the way of things, but that's like another story entirely. Yeah, and another thing I want to join, or at least like experiences the choir group, as like anyone could literally join in and sing, but only if they like apply for it, and it's set in Toronto, which isn't too far from where I live, which is convenient, or which is convenient for me at least. So, right, and also like I mentioned before, I like singing, and I actually did sing in choirs at least when I was in elementary school. So like, and also I was in my church choir at least before I moved, but like I've always wanted to kind of sing kind of openly, like, and as you can see from my music box covers or even my I mean, I haven't made any proper vocal covers, but I am planning to release a video sometime this December, as it's a special, like, surprise that I'm planning. Though what song I'm singing, I can't tell you, at least not yet. I know there are parents that they try to do their best to raise children, but unfortunately, there are some people where I wonder, or they can't help but leave you wondering, why are they parents in the first place? What do they do to deserve to have children, while others who genuinely want to be parents can never have children? I mean, either through adoption or even through, like, the usual method. I mean, there are some parents that I really hate and will not portray positively in my story. And while like, my parents, they're far from perfect, but they do genuinely care for me, even if they do confess sometimes, like, a bit hard for me to handle. But then again, like, with my imperfect social skills and bad habit of saying the wrong thing, like, I'm also at fault for that. But even so, there are some parents who don't even have excuses of being bad parents and should either have their children removed from them or just never have children at all. But then again, that's probably what they would want it. But anyway, there are certain parents that I really hate. Like, one thing, like, obviously, the parent that favors another child over the other, but at the same time have no problem pressuring the other child, or rather, especially if they're the firstborn child, into living up to their expectations. And when they don't, they just callously throw them away like they're garbage or just some unused puppet, which I really hate. And there are some times where I wish certain parents would just like drop dead, or at least never have children at all, so that way they won't cause a sort of generational trauma throughout their descendants, and hopefully it'll be broken in some way. That is, if their children can at least like grow up to be proper adults without any like lingering negative effects of their parents' horrible parenting, right? Another kind of parent that I really hate is the kind that'll not only favor their children, but actively encourage them to fight against each other or compete for their affection and respect, as it just causes their children to have a lot of unresolved trauma. Not to mention, they'll become distrustful of anyone that they should have cared about, like their own siblings, right? And if it doesn't, and if they and if their children end up dying because of it, the parent will most likely just see them as useless or anything, and they'll, especially if they try to experiment on their children, either psychologically or physically, which I really hate. And don't get me started on how sometimes the parent will like reveal that they never cared about the child and only saw them as byproducts or extensions of their own lives, which I also really hate and wish they would just drop dead, as they are not only like making things worse for the families, but they're also not even properly contributing to society, as it's not just the emotional or like say moral aspects of that kind of parenting that I hate, but it's also the pragmatic style, as they're basically going to ruin their children and turn them into either criminals or even psychopaths who have no idea how to live properly. And while neglectful parents are just as bad, but the fact that there are a lot of parents who have horrible skills or parenting skills to the point where I'm surprised so many people end up being well adjusted after experiencing such horrific trauma. Yeah, but at the same time, I really wish the best for the children who have to deal with them, especially since my own father is actually a social worker, and he, like, let's just say he has encountered people with really like horrible or dysfunctional parents, though he hasn't given me a lot of details for like obvious reasons. Oh, right, and one more thing. Another kind of bad parent I really hate is the kind that expects their children to be better than them, but never do anything to prove themselves. I mean, seriously, you're their parent. If you're going to have their children be responsible. At least try to be responsible yourselves, or better yet, like be good role models for them and their children. Well, that is if they even want to have children because of you. But even so, there are sometimes hypocrisy is very hard to control or at least prevent. But in this case, like they don't even have the excuse to, or they don't even bother with the excuse to justify their actions and why they're allowed to do certain things while their children can't. So, yeah. Another thing I want to avoid in my stories is double standards and hypocrisy, or rather, characters who get away with hypocrisy way too much, especially when it comes to, like, I guess, gender roles, where I want to show that abusers can be both male and female. Yeah, especially if female abusers are involved, they will receive punishment. And my stories, they'll have a bit of social commentary when it comes to somewhat dark themes like crime or abuse, or even other ones like kidnapping, trafficking, and slavery, especially, which will be a huge no-no in my stories, as I want to show that people are capable of being evil, but they are capable of being good, but only if they choose to, or if they really want to earn their, say, redemption, as redemption will also be a major part of my stories. Right, so I thought it'd be interesting to let you guys know. Another quick thing I like to talk about, like, and it'll be very brief, where, like, you know how people often show physical signs of affection, like hugging or shaking hands or even pats on the back, but then kissing is a very interesting concept, as most of the time, especially nowadays, like, you'd expect people to kiss you on the cheek as a sign of affection, or at least platonically speaking, especially if it's between family members or friends. But apparently there are some people who do kiss each other on the lips, but again, it's only for platonic purposes and not for, like, romantic or even erotic purposes. Though it is interesting how kissing works, as kissing is seen as the ultimate sign of affection, though it can sometimes be used as a way to mock others. I mean, hence why there's, like, the trope, like the take that kiss. Yeah, but most of the time it's supposed to be the universal symbol of love, like, and not just romantic, but platonic love, or even familial or friendly love. Though apparently I've heard of people actually kissing their own family members on the mouth, which does come off as rather weird or even creepy in some cases, for various reasons I do not want to talk about. But most of the time it's seen as, like, a sign of affection that shouldn't be looked, like, into so much, like, for social reasons. Though my dad did mention that he saw a father kiss his own son on the lips. Though for me, I personally like to kiss people on the cheek, as I'm not really ready to kiss people on the lip, at least not yet. Though, especially if it's my parents or even, like, my sister. Though I do recall when I was younger that I like to kiss even my teachers on the cheek as a sign of affection. But then again, I was a really quirky kid at the time, and still am at some point. So what can you do?